During the last year, there's been one big debate around higher education, a debate powerfully kicked off in 2021 by J.D. Vance.
So much of what we want to accomplish, so much of what we want to do in this movement in this country, I think are fundamentally dependent on going through a set of very hostile institutions, specifically the universities, which control the knowledge in our society, which control what we call truth and what we call falsity.
Vance had graduated from Ohio State University and Yale Law School, and when he gave that speech, he had only recently announced his candidacy for Ohio Senate. But still, he was focused on big ideas, the big picture, the national picture, and on a deep concern that higher education in America is just too liberal.
And so I'm excited to close this conference with this particular set of remarks, because I think if any of us want to do the things that we want to do for our country and for the people who live in it, we have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country.
In the Trump administration, Vice President Vance's ideas have found a friendly audience, and much of the last year has been about bringing elite schools to heel. But there's another debate about higher education we could be having, a debate that goes way beyond wealthy elite schools, a debate not about whether higher education is too liberal, but about whether it's too conservative. Not conservative politically, but conservative in the sense of trying to conserve old ways of doing things.
Lecturing, talking at people is not a particularly effective way of teaching them. And yet that has pretty much been the default mode in higher education for centuries.
What if, instead of the debate we've been having around universities, we should have been having a different debate? And what if there's a greater threat facing higher ed than the Trump administration?
A faculty member accused me of trying to turn the college into a kindergarten, simply because I wanted to raise this question. And you know, I put some blame on myself. At a certain point, you just say, as I say in the book, look, this isn't worth it.
Welcome to It Turns Out. I'm Kara Miller. Brian Rosenberg is the former president of Macalester College, and he's seen how hard it can be to bring change to campus. He has also seen, and we'll get to this, how profound the Trump effect has been on universities.
I try to maintain some optimism, and it's based upon the fact that the big mistake that authoritarians often make is that they overreach. And so they try to do too much, and they reach a certain point where people say there's no choice but to push back.
Rosenberg is the author of the book, Whatever It Is, I'm Against It, from Harvard Education Press. He's now a visiting professor at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I asked him to lay out for me, in simple terms, the serious problem he sees facing academia, and why it's important to note that in the last year, and always, our focus tends to be on a couple dozen of the richest schools. But in fact, the problem goes way, way beyond that.
So first, I just want to underscore your initial point, which is that the perception that most people have of American higher education is based on a very small number of schools that get covered in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And they represent a tiny percentage of what actually happens in American higher education. But the problem that I try to underscore goes beyond just those schools, and that is that higher education has changed less over the last century, 2 centuries, 5 centuries than any other industry. And the world around it has changed dramatically. And as the world has changed and higher education has not changed, I think it's become decreasingly effective in serving its social purpose. That is, it is not as effective as it needs to be either in educating students or in providing access to students, or in graduating students. And so there are lots of great things about higher education, but there are lots of areas that need improvement. And this inability to change makes improvement really hard.
To what degree does there's a kind of demographic cliff that people talk about, which is, people have been having fewer kids for decades, actually. But in 2008, there was like a big leg down in the fertility rate as sort of a reaction to the financial crisis.
Yeah, the Great Recession did not help fertility rates.
Exactly. But it really never, people thought, oh, maybe it'll pick back up, but it didn't really pick back up. So just as a sort of I want to get into some of the content that you outlined, but just sort of as a numbers thing, how troublesome are the numbers for academia?
If you're a school that worries about admissions, they're extremely troublesome. Obviously, if you're Harvard or Princeton or Amherst, you're not going to have to worry about fewer students because you accept so few. But what we're looking at over the next decade or so is about a 15% decline in the number of students in the United States who graduate from high school. We are an aging country. The median age in the United States is closing in on 40. By contrast, the median age in Africa is about 19. And so fewer students means fewer applicants to college, means less revenue for colleges. It means probably that there are a fair number of colleges that are going to close. Right now, there is oversaturation in the market, and that's only going to get worse. It's particularly bad in the region where I'm sitting right now, that is New England, the Northeast, and the Midwest, which also happens to be where most of the private colleges and universities in the country are located.
Reconcile that for me with like a parent's listening and they hear it's so hard to get into college and your kids have to have these great, I don't know, list of activities and everybody's taking SAT prep classes. Square for me with what you're saying with what people sometimes, like the lived experience of people.
It's not hard to get into college. It's hard to get into a small group of brand name colleges, which, as I said, is what people tend to focus on, and what people who attend expensive private high schools or well-funded suburban schools tend to focus on. When in fact there are 4,000 colleges in the United States, and the vast majority of them essentially accept everybody, even though they describe themselves as selective. They basically accept everybody. So it is hard to get in if you focus on that small number of schools. And as a number of people have been pointing out recently, including Jeff Salingo in a recent book, not getting into one of those schools isn't the end of the world. You could learn a lot, and you could be perfectly successful by going to lots of the schools that are not hard to get into.
So you talked about this resistance to change. And let me just ask you a little bit about that, because you really press on this in what you've written. Like you talk about, there are things, you talk about Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter. Like there are things that cannot be talked about in faculty meetings. And I want to get into some of those things. But first of all, we've spent a lot of the last year talking about conservatism or lack of conservatism on campus. So I wonder, you have people on campus that may be liberal in their politics, but what in your mind makes people so conservative in this sense of wanting to conserve the way that things are done and sort of not wanting to see change?
Yeah, it is. It's a conundrum that provoked me to write the book. That is, higher education is a deeply conservative industry populated by highly progressive people. And how does that make any sense? And when you have something that is so widespread, I tend to assume it's not about individual bad actors, but it's about cultures and structures. And so I think what's happened is higher education has built up a culture and has developed a series of structures that make change agonizingly difficult. And so the only way to make change less difficult is to think about how we change those cultures and those structures. So it's not about people not wanting to do a good job. It's about people embedded in a system where change is made extremely difficult. And as you say, extremely difficult even to talk about.
So let's talk about some specific ways in which, as you say, like change, it's hard to affect change even amongst a progressive group of people often. And one example is people often think of, I think at universities, that the best sort of professor is like great in the classroom, partially because they just do groundbreaking research and they're super prolific in their research. And you tried to look at the evidence on this and you found what?
I found that not only did people not want to accept the evidence, they didn't want to talk about the evidence. So there's absolutely no empirical evidence to suggest that being a great researcher and being a great teacher correlate directly with one another. Fortunately, the evidence doesn't suggest a negative correlation, but this notion that props up, especially research universities, that if you're a great researcher, it means you're also a great teacher, isn't supported by the evidence. And so when I was a president at Macalester, we tried to initiate a conversation about that. And by we, I mean a faculty member who did some research on this and myself. And what we found was tremendous resistance even to talking about it, to the point where a faculty member accused me of trying to turn the college into a kindergarten, simply because I wanted to raise this question. And you know, I put some blame on myself. At a certain point, you just say, as I say in the book, look, this isn't worth it. I have other ways to spend my time that don't involve fighting a battle I can't win.
Right. And your political capital, right? You only have so much political capital, I assume. And so you don't necessarily want to spend it all on something you're going to lose.
You have to spend it very, very wisely.
I wonder why people who are aiming to be great researchers will not accept the research on that, like, being a great researcher and being a great professor are not really one and the same and have no particular correlation. My guess is that it's because the entire structure of academia, much bigger than Macalester, is built on this idea. And so if you want to change it at Macalester, it's like unilaterally disarming and being like, okay, yeah, now I can never get a job anywhere else.
It is absolutely the entire foundation upon which the edifice is built. So just think about higher education for a minute. Who has the most prestige? Who gets paid the most? It is the faculty who are star researchers and who do the least teaching. Who has the least prestige and paid the least? Faculty in community colleges, who actually do the most teaching of the students who need it most. So the prestige system and the reward system in higher education is all based upon the fact that being a great researcher is the most important thing you can be. And no one would want to talk about the fact that sometimes those great researchers are pretty terrible teachers. It would undermine the foundation upon which all this is built.
It's so incredible that, like, people who value research so much don't want to hear the research on this particular slice of their lives.
This is not about logic. It's about your own personal history. This is the way I was taught. This is the way it must be. And it's about a kind of article of faith. As we know, human beings are not necessarily persuaded by evidence when the evidence contradicts their deepest beliefs. And this is as true for academics as for anybody else.
When you talked about who makes the most money in terms of professors in academia, it feels a little bit, and correct me if I'm wrong, it feels a little bit like that pyramid is crumbling, in the sense that fewer and fewer people, it seems like, are at the sort of top of that tenure pyramid. It feels like there are more and more adjuncts all the time, which is to say people who teach but don't really do research because they get paid per class. I don't know. Does it feel to you like that tenure pyramid is crumbling a little bit?
Yeah, tenure is, I would describe it as withering away. Okay. It's not so much being formally eliminated as being worked around. So what you're finding at more and more schools is they're not ending tenure and they're not getting rid of tenured faculty, but rather than hiring new tenure faculty, they are, as you say, hiring adjuncts, often at very low pay, often without benefits. And so it's creating a kind of two-tiered class system in higher education. There are a few jobs that are better than being a tenured faculty member at a good institution. But there are a few jobs that are more challenging than being an adjunct faculty member who's essentially a gig worker trying to piece together a career by teaching courses at multiple institutions. It's not a healthy situation right now.
I mean, and to underscore that, I have known people who've had that kind of gig, as you say, and they might teach one place in the morning, drive somewhere else in the afternoon where they're able to kind of piece together some classes. They might be paid $5,000 a class or $7,000 a class. So maybe they're putting together $60,000 over the course of the whole year, but they have no health care. I mean, they have no job security. As you say, it's very much the opposite of being a tenured professor. They're also not on the road to anything because they're sort of just kind of keeping up, and there's nowhere to sort of build this career forward.
And many graduate students realize this. I mean, the average amount of time it takes to complete a humanities degree now at places like Harvard is 7 or 8 years, when it should be 4 or 5. And one of the reasons is that students aren't in any rush to leave and go on the job market. You know, as long as they're a graduate student, they have health insurance and they have some guaranteed teaching. You leave that and you enter into a lot of economic uncertainty. So I think there's a pretty widespread awareness in the industry that the current situation is neither good nor fair. But as I said, it's really hard to change. I mean, there are solutions to this. You could easily move to a situation where you hired people not with tenure, but on multi-year contracts where they were reviewed and evaluated full-time, had benefits, but weren't guaranteed a job until they were 80.
Right. Which is to say, like most jobs, right?
Which is to say, like pretty much every job. I mean, the vast majority of people who are in the workforce don't even have the guarantee of a 5-year contract. They're at-will employees.
Sure.
So the only ones who have the guarantee that tenured faculty have are federal judges. And there aren't that many of them. There are a lot more tenured faculty members.
You kind of talked about universities, colleges not changing with the times, also in terms of what they offer and how they serve students. What's the problem there? How do they not serve students maybe in the way that they should?
You know, I think it begins with pedagogy, with the way people teach. There are reams and reams of evidence now, and this is not a new idea. It goes back to John Dewey in the late 19th century, that lecturing, talking at people is not a particularly effective way of teaching them. And yet that has pretty much been the default mode in higher education for centuries. Students come into a classroom, you fill their head with knowledge, and they leave. And any of us who've gone through that, including myself, know that most of what you learn that way, you forget. It doesn't stick with you. Most of the things that stick with you, you learn by doing. So experiential learning through doing things, through team projects, through interactive learning, through internships, tends to be, as a rule, more effective than listening to a lecture. And yet higher education is still stuck in the information delivery mode, and that's not serving students well. And higher education still struggles with the notion that there is not necessarily a conflict between preparing students for a vocation and introducing them to the liberal arts. Those things should not be in tension, and yet they still are at many institutions.
I mean, here again, if the evidence shows, and as you say, it really does, that sort of getting kids involved in things, getting them talking to each other, doing interactive things is really much more effective than like this unidirectional lecturing at them. And yet there's still a lot of lecturing at students. It makes you wonder, how is it possible that people who really value research, who really value learning, who really value, I mean, many professors love the schools that they're at and value those schools. Why would they not want them to be the most effective, amazing educational institutions you can imagine?
First of all, as we've talked about, change is hard. You know, if you're used to lecturing, if you've lectured for 20 years and suddenly you're confronted with evidence that doesn't work very well, redoing everything that you've been doing and rethinking everything that you've assumed is really hard. and people generally are reluctant to do that. And there is, I think, this belief that, well, it was done to me, it worked for me, I'm a professor now, so
Right.
it must be effective. And it's also more labor intensive in a lot of ways. You could lecture to 500 students in a giant lecture hall at the same time. Designing education that relies more heavily on interactive learning can be a lot more time consuming, and it also has the potential to be more expensive.
Mm-hmm. Well, and like you said, I mean, people are expecting they'll teach that same class again that they did last year and the year before. And on the side, they're writing a book or they're doing a paper. And now you're saying, well, throw out all those lecture notes and do this new thing. Yeah, I mean, you're not going to have any time for research this semester. And it sounds like people are like, that wasn't my plan.
Well, and that also gets to the reward system, particularly at research universities and at selective liberal arts colleges, which is you get rewarded for research. You don't get tenure at Harvard because of how you teach. You get tenure at Harvard because of the research and scholarship you do. So if you are a faculty member, what is your incentive for devoting a lot more time to making yourself a better teacher when you're not going to get rewarded for it? People do the things for which they get rewarded. And at its elite level, higher education does not reward teaching, it rewards scholarship.
Has Harvard or any place ever considered, because so many people want to come there to learn, valuing teaching or prioritizing teaching in awarding money, awarding tenure, status, rank, whatever?
They're certainly not at Harvard that I'm aware of. There are research universities that have created positions that are not tenured and not tenure track, but are full-time and focus pretty much exclusively on teaching. They're still not as well compensated and they're still not as prestigious as a tenured professor. But there is, I think, some growing awareness that, maybe it's not a bad thing to have people here whose number one priority and whose strongest skill is teaching. But it's very, very slow at the upper levels. It's certainly much more widespread, say, at the community college level, where I think a lot of the most interesting things in higher education are happening. You don't get promoted, you don't become successful at a community college on the basis of research. You have to be a good teacher, and you have to do a lot of teaching.
Yes, but this, as you say, feeds into that whole sort of reverse incentive thing, because if you think about where professors can make the most money, I'm guessing it's not community colleges.
It is not community colleges.
Right. Yeah. Let's talk about something else that I think people tend to accept as gospel, but when you looked at it, you weren't quite so sure you did, which is the idea that students should definitely have majors. Want to tackle that?
Sure. So, one of the problems with American higher education, one of the fundamental problems, that the institutions are built not around students, but around faculty. At the end of the day, the whole point of a college or university should be to educate students. And so you should create a structure that does that most effectively. Why do we have majors at colleges and universities? Why do we have even at small institutions? At Macalester, we had 2,000 students in 35 different departments. Why are we divided that way? Not because it's the optimal way to teach, but because that's the way faculty are trained. When you go to graduate school and you become a PhD student in English or history or geology or biology, you expect to graduate and move into an English or history or geology or biology department. And so the structure of these curricula are based around faculty interests and expertise and not what would be most effective for students. When we know that there are very few problems in the world that students will have to deal with that don't require multidisciplinary knowledge. So it's because it's built around faculty training and expertise and not around what would be optimal educationally.
How, if you were in charge, how would you sort of collide those two things? Because if you really wanted change, and let's say you were in a position where you could enact change, you've got this legacy system where, as you say, people did get degrees, PhDs in English and history and biology and so on and so forth, like in subject disciplines. And then you're saying, well, but in the new world, it doesn't really make sense because like very few people go on to get jobs in history. Okay, so what would you do and how would you knit together like the old system, which you would have to reckon with for at least a few decades, and the new system?
Right. It's a lot easier when you're starting from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
So just as a quick aside, at the African Leadership University, which is now just 10 years old, students don't have majors, they choose missions. So they choose an issue that is particularly relevant to the African continent, and they build their whole education around that mission. That's a lot harder to do with a legacy institution, but you can do some things. Arthur Levine, who's the president now at Brandeis, is doing some really interesting things there to try to fold departments and divisions into smaller, more cohesive units. And by smaller, I mean with fewer divisions among them. Is there really any reason why you have to have 7 or 8 different humanities or social science departments as opposed to divisions of the humanities or divisions of social sciences, where the structures encourage faculty to interact with one another and to design courses where they interact with one another rather than to just stick in their lane? So, you're not going to go overnight from 35 departments to no majors.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to happen. But I think you can begin slowly over time to try to break down some of those silos that exist and get faculty to interact more with one another, and then them to interact more with one another in the classroom and to teach students and to rethink the way students define their educational journey.
And it actually strikes me that in some ways, students have already de facto done this a little bit. Like, I don't know, I would bet that most people who major in economics, not everybody, wants a job in finance, right? So they've already taken a few, I would guess, majors that feel like they have these clear linkages to things in the real world and decided like, here's my mission to be in finance, and here's the path I'm going to go on.
That is happening. I mean, that certainly you're seeing students flock to certain majors that seem to have better job prospects. The danger in that, of course, is that things can change really quickly. So even 5 or 6 years ago, majoring in computer science seemed like a golden ticket.
Right.
Now the worst employment prospects are for computer science majors because AI is making most of those jobs obsolete. We've seen the same thing over time with engineering majors. So it's a little bit challenging to choose your educational focus purely on the basis of what the job market is telling you right now. But you are seeing students becoming increasingly interested in what I would describe as multidisciplinary areas. So when I was at Macalester, the faculty created programs in areas like community and global health, human rights and humanitarianism, food, agriculture, and society, data science. They were super popular. Students flocked to them. The problem was because we had all those departments, we couldn't make them majors and we couldn't staff them appropriately. So we called them concentrations. Students loved them. If they were majors, they would have been among the most popular majors. But it's hard to make room for them when you can't get rid of anything else. So I think if students were presented with more opportunities to do things like focus on global health or environmental health, rather than majoring in biology or in geology, I think they would do it. And I don't think that would require blowing apart the whole system.
But I'm sure and I'm sure you've encountered this, I'm sure there is fear. Like when you talk about collapsing a bunch of humanities departments into one called like the humanities department, I'm sure people start to think, wait a minute, does that mean we're not going to have a Milton person, a Chaucer person, a Shakespeare person? We're not going to have a 19th century, an 18th century. I mean, that they are worried.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I totally get it. It's an industry that's under a lot of financial pressure. And one of the things that higher education has to figure out a way to do is bend its cost curve. It's too expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And so people who work in higher education are understandably concerned about reductions in faculty positions, about job loss. I totally get it. And so it's one of the very rational sources of resistance that you encounter.
Let's talk about money for a second. You make some super interesting points about money, but let me just start with the big picture, which I think for an average person, a parent, they look at the cost of, let's take private nonprofit colleges over the last several decades, and they just think, oh my gosh, this has gone through the roof. What is going on? Like, why do colleges and universities charge so much? And what's the answer? Why do they charge so much?
So you're right. People talk about why the public is losing faith in higher education. They tend to immediately think about politics. But there was just a recent Pew survey about attitudes toward higher education. And the number one thing that people weren't happy about was not politics, it was cost. And so that is the single most important underlying problem. It is true that at a lot of these elite institutions, lots of people don't pay that full price. So if you go to a place like Harvard or Williams, and they'll look at your ability to pay, and they'll give you a very generous financial aid package. And even less wealthy institutions are discounting because they have to. The discount rate, the average discount rate at a private college in the United States now is approaching 60%. So everything's on sale for 60% off.
Well, but I should say, I did a little looking before this interview at some private nonprofit schools. I think, I looked at like Williams, NYU. I mean, these places all in are in the $90,000 a year range, which is,
insane.
Before taxes, a lot of money, and after taxes, a lot of money.
Yeah, no, even people who can afford to pay it are looking at it and scratching their heads and saying, do I want to pay that?
Right.
There are schools now where if you count all the costs, it's over $100,000. And so you're talking about spending close to $500,000 on an undergraduate education. Why have we gotten here? We could spend a whole hour talking about this, but the simple economic explanation is something called cost disease. Higher education has become more expensive without becoming more efficient. And when it becomes more expensive to hire faculty and staff, when it becomes more expensive to meet federal regulations, when it becomes more expensive to keep buildings going, but you don't become any more efficient, your costs tend to go up. And so that's what's happened in higher education. Technology has bent the cost curve in most manufacturing areas, and in some service areas like financial services, you can now buy and trade stocks online. But in higher education, technology has not yet bent the cost curve, but it might. If you look at places like Southern New Hampshire, which is mostly online, they have almost 250,000 students. So you could be looking at actors in the marketplace that are beginning to use technology to make things less expensive.
You make this fascinating point, which is that there have been schools that have said, I know this is very expensive. Let's sort of, could we do 3 years? I mean, if you think about it, a year of college, we talked about the expense of a year of college, but a year of college is not a year of college, right? You don't go to school a lot of that year, maybe like 4 months you don't go to school.
I have 2 sons. I sent them off to school. They were barely gone and they were back.
Exactly, exactly. So you could imagine some situation in which a school says, let's just take 3 years to get you through this. Or you point out situations in which schools have actually said, let's make things less expensive. Maybe the college will be more alluring. And I mean, which I think is a really interesting experiment, but it didn't go well.
Yeah, you're seeing colleges try it again. So the 3-year degree up until now has not taken off. I mean, look,
Okay.
let's be honest. The American college calendar is insane. You basically go to school 8 months a year. And so you have these super expensive campuses that essentially sit empty or host summer camps for a big portion of the year. There's absolutely no reason that you couldn't complete the same number of courses and credits in 3 years. And that would save you a year of tuition and a year of opportunity cost. But college is as much a rite of passage as it is an investment. And it's really hard to convince, it has been so far, to convince students and families that they're getting the same thing in 3 years that they could get in 4.
Mm-hmm.
As far as lowering the cost, economists refer to something called the Chivas Regal effect.
Which I love. I mean, not the drink, but I love the effect.
People just assume if something's more expensive, if it's more expensive, it must be better.
Yeah.
Think about going into a liquor store, and you look at the bottles of wine along the higher shelves, and they cost more. And then you look at the $8.99 bottles on the lower shelf. You don't know a thing about any of those bottles, but your assumption is, well, those $50 bottles must be better than those $10 bottles.
Totally.
And it's the same with something like higher education, which you have no way of testing. You just assume that the $70,000 education must be better than the $25,000 education. Otherwise, why would it not cost less? So colleges that lower price have generally not seen a bump in the marketplace because people assume they're lowering quality.
That's incredible because, as you say, people respond to surveys and say, what the heck? What's up with the price of college education? But then a private school tries to lower the price and they're like, I bet that Princeton's more expensive because it's better.
Right.
So it kind of puts a limit on what you can actually do, right?
Yeah, well, again, more schools are trying it now, and we'll see if they get traction. The other problem with simply cutting the cost, let's say you cost $50,000 and you cut it to $25,000. The only way that's going to make sense for you financially is if you basically stop giving financial aid. If you just say, this is our cost for everybody.
Right.
So you're going to actually benefit the wealthier students who suddenly had their price cut in half, but you're potentially going to make things harder for the most high need students, who are now suddenly going to have to pay $25,000. So it's a tricky thing to navigate.
So we've talked so far, really without talking about President Trump and his attack on universities. Let me just get a sense, especially now that you're sitting at Harvard, even though you've been in most of your life at academia, not been at Harvard. How shocking has this, or maybe not, but how shocking has this been for you to see?
On one level, it's been profoundly shocking. I mean, even in my worst nightmares, I didn't expect to see what we've seen over the last 10 months. But on another level, I think it should not have been shocking, because if you have been watching over the last few years what's happened in Florida, particularly, and in some other Republican-controlled states, if you've been reading material that's been published by the American Enterprise Institute or the Manhattan Institute, you can see that they've been laying out this playbook. And so this is not something that has just been, that popped out of somebody's head suddenly. This has been planned for a long time. This use of federal funding and federal guidelines essentially to dramatically change American higher education. So it's been shocking to see it, but it's been in the planning stage for a long, long time.
Is this something that you think really came out of people's skepticism with higher education, which is something that you've written about? Or is this sort of the desire of an elite group of people who, just are like, they're elite and the people they're attacking are elite, but they're different elites?
Yeah, they're very much different elites. A lot of the
Yeah.
people who are leading the attack on elite higher education are themselves the product of elite higher education
Yes.
and are occupying very elite positions. I think it is much more political than anything else.
Okay.
There has been for a long time a sense among conservatives who are in power that liberals control the media, they control entertainment, they control higher education. And so if we're going to really shift the culture, we need to go after those areas. It's honestly a pretty standard authoritarian playbook. When you see authoritarians begin to assume power, these are the first things they go after. Because they're the areas that have the potential to shape people's opinions. So I think it's not about the cost of higher education. I don't think it's about anti-Semitism. I don't think it's about creating American jobs. I think it's about power and about political control. And if there's anything about it that really surprises me, it's the ease with which so many institutions have just rolled over, and the rapidity with which they've abandoned principles that they purport to be guided by.
Explain to me where you think this goes. And I would say, as like a piece of that, as we've discussed, a lot of the Trump administration's ire has been focused on elite colleges, whereas a lot of the troubles, as you've outlined, are not like the pending troubles that have nothing to do with the president, but have to do with enrollment and have to do with money and so on and so forth. They do not have to do with elite colleges. So, explain to me how you think this unfolds and changes higher education, if it does.
Well, I think it is one of the things that has changed, and I think in many ways changed irrevocably, is the relationship between higher education and the federal government. So since essentially the Second World War, there's been this assumption that the federal government and higher education were partners in particularly the research enterprise. And that's resulted, obviously, in a lot of federal money funding research at universities. And universities have built their budgets and their buildings and their faculties around the assumption that that was not going to change. And now suddenly people have been shown, you know what? It can change. And that money could vanish.
Right.
And I don't think we're ever going to go back to a point where people assume it's permanent. Because you can always be thinking, well, what happens if 2 presidents from now someone comes in and does the same thing? So I think you're going to see universities shift the way they think about their revenue, their budgets, their staffing. So that's a change that I think is permanent. Where is this going to go? I try to maintain some optimism, and it's based upon the fact that the big mistake that authoritarians often make is that they overreach. And so they try to do too much, and they reach a certain point where people say there's no choice but to push back. So I think, for instance, this compact that they put out initially to, I think, 9 institutions, and now they've extended to all of higher education, is so transparently a violation of academic freedom and the law that you're not seeing a lot of takers. And it's the first, I'm not sure if I would describe it as pushback, but it's at least a little bit of pushback to what the administration is doing. I think if they had stuck with just going after one institution at a time, it would have been strategically more effective. But by doing something that was so extreme, I think they've forced institutions to say, you know what, we have to push back a little bit against this. So I am holding out hope that they will go far enough that institutions will feel the need to push back more than they have so far.
A final question. Sometimes a crisis forces change. Is this the kind of crisis, not that you saw it coming, that would force the kind of change you've thought about? Or is this is not it?
I mean, I do think it will force change, and I do think some of that change may be good change. Generally, people don't do their best thinking in the middle of a crisis.
Yeah.
I liken what the Trump administration has done to higher education to sort of a tornado just leveling a town.
Yeah.
And you may have thought, well, there are lots of ways we can improve this town. Now all you're doing is trying to rebuild after the tornado. Or you're trying to just hide in a hole and not get destroyed. And so, yes, change and even good change could come out of this, but right now the entire industry is sort of in hunker down in our foxhole mode, and that is not a good way to, I think, provoke effective change.
Brian Rosenberg is the former president of Macalester College. He's currently a visiting professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's also the author of this book, Whatever It Is, I'm Against It, from Harvard Education Press. We will have a link to it on our website, itturnsoutShow.com. Brian, thanks very much. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. This was fun.
Please subscribe to It Turns Out on YouTube and like us. It helps other people discover the show. Or you can hear us on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. And at our website, which is itturnsoutShow.com, and in the show notes, we're going to link to a really interesting piece from the journalist resource from the Harvard Kennedy School about the funding of higher ed. It answers big picture questions like, how do states differ in how they fund higher ed? How much do schools rely on endowments? And how much does the federal government fund different kinds of schools? Again, the link for that piece will be at itturnsoutShow.com. Thanks so much to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for their generous support. Thanks to producer Matt Purdy. And thanks to you for joining us. Talk to you next time.